Let's get started. Story number 1.
The night was darker than usual, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The air carried a damp chill, making the empty streets seem even more desolate. Akash zipped up his jacket and adjusted his helmet as he waited outside. The Spice Box, a small 24-hour restaurant that had become one of his regular pickup spots. It was past 2 a.m. and he had already completed several deliveries, hoping to squeeze in one last order before heading home. Just as he was about to log out, a new order popped up on his phone. Pickup, the Spice Box. Delivery, house number 7, Rana Colony. Rana Colony? He had never heard of it before. Curious, he checked the map. The location was near the outskirts, an area he rarely delivered to. The payout was unusually high, almost 5 times the normal rate. He hesitated for a moment. Orders with abnormally high payouts were usually red flags. Either the area was unsafe or the address was unreliable. Still, money was money. He tapped accept and walked into the restaurant to pick up the order. The cashier, a middle-aged man with graying hair, looked up as Akash gave the order number. As soon as he saw the address, his expression changed. Rana Colony? The man repeated, lowering his voice. Who placed the order? Akash glanced at the screen. The order had no name, just a phone number. Not sure, he said, but the app says it's prepaid. The cashier and a younger waiter exchanged looks. The waiter quickly packed the food, but his hands moved stiffly, as if he was unsettled. Be careful out there, the cashier said as he handed over the bag. Akash nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping into his chest. The roads became narrower as he followed the GPS toward Rana Colony. The usual hum of the city faded behind him, replaced by an eerie silence. The streetlights were sparse, some flickering as he passed. The trees on either side of the road grew thicker, their branches casting jagged shadows. His phone buzzed. A new message. Almost here? We are waiting. There was no name, no profile picture, just the message. Akash swallowed hard but kept riding. The GPS led him down a dirt road lined with abandoned houses. Many were crumbling, their windows shattered, doors barely hanging onto their hinges. The air grew colder, making his skin prickle beneath his jacket. Finally, he reached the pinned location. There was no colony, just an old, decaying house standing alone at the end of the road. The wooden gates were half broken, hanging loose on their rusted hinges. The house itself was massive but lifeless. The paint had peeled away, exposing rotting wood. The windows were dark, some covered in grime. The front door was slightly open, revealing nothing but blackness inside. Akash checked the address again. House number 7, Rana Colony. But there was no colony, only this house. His phone buzzed. Bring it inside. Akash felt his stomach tighten. He quickly typed back, I'm outside. Can you come take the food? Another message. Bring it inside. We are hungry. A chill ran down his spine. Akash turned his bike around, deciding to cancel the order. But just as he was about to leave, the door creaked open. On its own, a thick wave of cold air drifted out from inside, carrying a damp, musty odor. Akash's breath caught. The night felt unnaturally silent. No wind, no insects, just an overwhelming stillness. Then he heard it. A whisper. Soft. Faint. Come in. It hadn't come from his phone. It had come from inside the house. Akash's instincts screamed at him to leave, but something held him in place. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else. With hesitant steps, he moved toward the entrance. The wooden floor groaned under his weight. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. A dim yellow light flickered down the hallway, casting long shadows along the walls. Then, a soft thud. From deeper inside the house, his phone buzzed again. Dining room. Akash's fingers trembled. He stepped forward cautiously, the hallway stretching before him. The wallpaper was faded, peeling away in long strips. Old, dusty portraits hung on the walls like their subjects staring blankly at him. As he neared the dining room, the air grew colder. Then he saw them. 3 figures sitting at the dining table. They were motionless. Their clothes were old, covered in dust. Their heads were slightly tilted downward as if frozen in time. Then one of them slowly raised its head. Black, empty eyes. No pupils, no whites, just darkness. Akash's pulse pounded in his ears. Then in a voice that made his bones turn cold, they spoke together. You made it. Akash dropped the food bag. Then a chair creaked. One of them stood up. It took a step toward him, then another. Akash bolted. His body moved before his mind could process what was happening. He ran, his breath ragged, heart hammering. Behind him, he heard footsteps, light, quick, getting closer. As he reached the entrance, a cold, skeletal hand brushed against his shoulder. He didn't look back. He leaped onto his bike, hands shaking as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he sped away without glancing at the house again. It wasn't until he was back in the city, surrounded by streetlights and people, that he stopped, gasping for air. His phone buzzed. Dreading what he would see, he looked at the screen. A new message. "You forgot your tip." Then, the order disappeared. No record, no history, nothing. The next day, Akash searched for Rana Colony on the map. It wasn't there. It didn't exist. Still shaken, he asked a chaiwala near his usual delivery area about it. The old man's face darkened. "Rana Colony?" he murmured. "Son, that place was abandoned years ago. A family used to live in that house. All of them died under mysterious circumstances. Some say their spirits still linger, waiting for visitors." Akash felt his body go numb. "Then, who placed the order?" he whispered. The old man sighed. "Maybe," he said. "They're still hungry." Akash never worked the night shift again.
Story number 2.
The air was cold that night, colder than usual for early summer. It had rained earlier in the evening, leaving the streets damp and glistening under the dim glow of the streetlights. Rahul pulled his hoodie tighter around himself as he weaved through the nearly empty roads on his bike. He had been working as a food delivery driver for almost a year, and night shifts had become his preference. Better tips, fewer traffic jams, and a peaceful kind of solitude. It was just past 2 a.m. when he decided it was time to log out. His last delivery had been to a 24-hour hostel, and he was already picturing himself back in his small rented room, warming up some instant noodles before crashing into bed. But just as he was about to close the app, a new order popped up. Pickup, Spice Junction. Delivery, house number 14, Maya Vihar Colony. Rahul frowned. Maya Vihar? He had never heard of it before. He opened his Maps app and searched for the location. It was on the outskirts, beyond the city's main limits, surrounded by a patch of thick trees and an old industrial area. The payout was nearly 4 times the usual amount. Something about it felt off. Orders that paid this much were either urgent VIP customers or places where no one wanted to go. He hesitated for a moment, but eventually accepted the order. Money was money. At Spice Junction, the staff looked at him strangely when he mentioned the delivery address. A middle-aged worker who had just finished mopping the floor stopped and turned toward him. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice uncertain. "Yeah," Rahul replied, forcing a small smile. "Why?" The worker exchanged glances with a younger cook before shaking his head. "Nothing. Just be careful on that road." Rahul nodded, pretending not to notice their unease. He grabbed the food bag and hopped back onto his bike. The city lights faded behind him as he rode out toward the outskirts. The roads became uneven, lined with trees that seemed taller and denser in the darkness. The further he went, the quieter it became. No traffic sounds, no distant honking, just the occasional chirping of crickets and the rustling of the leaves in the wind. His GPS directed him to a narrow road that looked almost abandoned. Potholes and cracks ran through the concrete, and there were no streetlights. The air felt thick here, heavy with a dampness that didn't match the season. Then his phone buzzed. A message from the customer. "Almost here. We are waiting." Rahul glanced at the screen. The message had no profile picture, just a blank icon. His stomach tightened slightly. He continued forward. Finally, the GPS announced, "You have arrived." Rahul slowed his bike and looked around. There was no colony, no houses, just an open field with a single, dilapidated house at the center. It was large, 2 stories high, but looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The windows were broken, the paint peeling off in large patches. The front door was slightly open, revealing nothing but blackness inside. He checked the address again. House number 14, Maya Vihar Colony. But there was no colony. Only this house. His phone buzzed again. "Bring it inside." Rahul's fingers felt icy as he typed back. "I'm outside. Can you come take the food?" A few seconds later, another message. "Bring it inside. We are hungry." Something about the wording made his skin crawl. He was about to cancel the order when the door creaked open on its own. His breath caught in his throat. The air around him felt colder now, unnaturally so. The trees seemed eerily still, as if holding their breath. Then he heard it. A whisper. Soft. Faint. Come in. It hadn't come from his phone. It had come from inside the house. A cold shiver ran down his spine. His legs were telling him to run, to get on his bike and leave, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Against his better judgment, he grabbed the food bag and took a hesitant step forward. The wooden floor inside groaned beneath his weight. The air smelled stale, like damp wood and something else, something rotten. The walls were lined with old paintings, their colors faded, their subjects staring blankly at him. A dim light flickered at the end of the hallway. His phone buzzed again. Dining room! His throat was dry. He called out, barely above a whisper. Silence. Send. A sound. Soft footsteps, but they weren't coming toward him. They were all around him. His heart pounded as he stepped toward the dimly lit room. And then he saw them. At the long wooden dining table sat 3 figures. They weren't moving. Their faces were pale. Too pale. Their clothes were dusty, old-fashioned, as if they had been sitting there for decades. Then, as if in unison, their heads slowly turned toward him. Their eyes? Black. Empty. A suffocating stillness filled the air. Then, in a whisper that made his bones turn cold, they spoke together. You made it. Rahul's entire body froze. The food bag slipped from his grip, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Then, a chair scraped. One of the figures stood up. It took a step forward, then another. Toward him. That was it. Rahul turned and ran. His legs moved before his mind could fully register what was happening. He sprinted through the hallway, feeling something behind him, something close, something reaching. As he neared the door, he felt it, a cold, bony hand grazing his shoulder. He didn't look back. He threw himself outside, scrambling onto his bike, hands shaking violently as he started the engine. The moment the bike roared to life, he twisted the throttle and sped away, heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't stop until he was back in the city, surrounded by the comforting noise of late-night traffic. Only then did he pull over, gasping for air. His phone buzzed. Dreading what he would see, he glanced at the screen. A new message. You forgot your tip. Then, the order disappeared. No history. No record. Nothing. The next day, Rahul searched for Maya Vihar Colony on the map. It wasn't there. It didn't exist. Still shaken, he asked an old tea vendor about it. The man's expression darkened. Maya Vihar? He murmured. That place was abandoned years ago. There was an old mansion there. Some say a family died inside, food poisoning or something. No one ever found their bodies. Rahul felt his blood turn to ice. Then, who placed the order? He whispered. The old man gave him a long, tired look. Maybe, he said. They're still waiting for their last meal. Rahul never worked the night shift again. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The night air was thick with humidity, wrapping itself around Anil like a suffocating blanket as he zipped through the dimly lit streets of Pune on his motorbike. The city, usually buzzing with energy, was quieter now, except for the occasional honking of a distant vehicle or the rustling of leaves in the warm breeze. Anil had been working as a food delivery rider for nearly a year, navigating through the city's chaotic streets and dark alleys. But tonight, something felt different. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. Another order. Last one for the night. He pulled up the details, an order from a small but well-known eatery, a single meal to be delivered to a place called Silver Oak Apartments. It wasn't a familiar location, but the map guided him well enough. As he followed the GPS, the roads became emptier, the streetlights fewer, the houses more spaced apart. Finally, he reached what the map insisted was his destination, but the sight before him made his stomach tighten. The Silver Oak Apartments looked abandoned. The building stood tall but lifeless, its windows hollow and dark. The entrance gate was rusted, one side slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the faint wind. He frowned. This couldn't be right. He checked his phone again. The customer's name was simply listed as A. Sharma. The instructions were clear. Come to the 3rd floor, room 306. Knock 3 times. Anil hesitated. He had delivered to some strange places before, but this one sent a chill through him. Still, he needed the money. With a deep breath, he parked his bike, grabbed the food package, and pushed the gate open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and dust. The lift was non-functional, of course, so he took the stairs. Each step echoed, amplifying the eerie silence around him. By the time he reached the third floor, a thin layer of sweat covered his forehead. The hallway was long and narrow, the walls stained with age. Some doors had nameplates, others were just blank, their surfaces chipped and peeling. Room 306 was at the far end. Anil stopped in front of it, adjusting the food bag in his hands. He hesitated, then, remembering the instructions, knocked 3 times. Silence. He waited. Then, slowly, the door creaked open on its own. His breath hitched. The room inside was dark, pitch black, as if light had never touched it. "Hello?" he called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence. No response, just stillness. Then suddenly, the sound of something shuffling inside. A scraping noise. "Sir, your order is here," Anil said, trying to keep his voice steady. Still no response. Everything inside him screamed to turn around, but his feet felt frozen in place. His phone buzzed in his pocket, making him jump. He pulled it out. A message. "Shh, come inside. Leave the food on the table." A knot tightened in his chest. His fingers hovered over the cancel button, but his curiosity or foolishness got the better of him. Taking a shaky breath, he stepped inside. The air inside was different. Heavy, cold, despite the warm summer night outside. The smell of something old and rotten lingered in the air. His eyes strained in the darkness until he noticed a faint outline of a wooden table in the center of the room. Summoning what little courage he had left, he took slow, deliberate steps, placed the food on the table, and turned around. That's when he heard it, a whisper, low, raspy, right behind him. His blood turned to ice. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Then a soft sound, the rustling of fabric, like someone shifting under a heavy sheet. His breathing turned ragged, and then he saw it, a shape, a figure, a man sitting in the corner of the room, hunched over at his face obscured by shadows. His head tilted at an unnatural angle. The air grew colder. Anil's body locked in place as the figure slowly lifted its head. A pair of hollow, sunken eyes stared at him, wide and unblinking, reflecting the faint glow of the city outside. Then the mouth twisted into a grin. A voice, no louder than a whisper, hissed. "You shouldn't have come." Anil stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. His body screamed at him to move, but it was as if the air itself had become too thick to push through. The figure in the corner began to rise. Jerky. Unnatural. Its limbs moved as if controlled by invisible strings. Anil found his voice just enough to let out a strangled gasp before he turned and bolted out of the room. He ran blindly, his feet barely touching the ground as he flew down the stairs, his breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. By the time he reached the gate, his hands were trembling so violently that he struggled to start his bike. When the engine roared to life, he twisted the throttle and shot down the street, never looking back. It was only when he reached a well-lit, populated area that he pulled over. His body shook uncontrollably. His breath was still ragged. His hands ached from gripping the handlebars too tightly. Finally, he checked his phone. The order was gone. No record of it, no message history. No A. Sharma in his recent deliveries. His stomach dropped. He scrolled through his logs, desperate for some proof that what had just happened was real. Then his eyes landed on something that made his breath catch. A single message. "Thank you for delivering. We were hungry." His vision blurred as he stared at the screen, his fingers cold and numb. Then, before his eyes, the message disappeared. Anil never took late-night deliveries again. Story the end.
Story number 4.
Ravi had been working as a food delivery driver for over a year now. Late-night deliveries were common for him, sometimes even past midnight. He didn't mind them. In fact, he preferred them. The roads were empty, there was no traffic, and he could complete his orders much faster. But there was always an uneasiness that came with working late at night. Some parts of the city, especially on the outskirts, had an eerie silence, where the only sounds were the distant howls of stray dogs or the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was a Saturday night, just past 1 a.m., when Ravi received an order from an unfamiliar restaurant called Sharma's Kitchen. The name didn't ring a bell, and he had never picked up from that place before, but he accepted the order anyway. It was a large order, multiple food packets, destined for an address on the outskirts of the city. The location was listed as House Number 14, Chinar Colony. Ravi frowned. He had never heard of Chinar Colony before. Curious, he checked the map, and to his surprise, the pin dropped in a secluded area near the old railway tracks where barely anyone lived. The place wasn't even marked properly, just a patch of gray with no visible roads leading up to it. A shiver ran down his spine, but he quickly brushed it off. Orders were orders, and he had delivered to strange places before. Maybe it was a farmhouse or an old residential area that wasn't updated on the maps. After picking up the food, he rode towards Chinar Colony. The city lights slowly faded behind him as he made his way down long, empty roads. The further he went, the fewer streetlights he saw, until finally he was riding in near darkness, the only illumination coming from his bike's headlight. The GPS led him onto a narrow dirt path where the road became rough and uneven. Tall, dry trees lined both sides of the road, their twisted branches stretching towards the sky like skeletal hands. The air was unnaturally still. Even the insects had gone silent. A sense of unease settled deep in his gut. He considered turning back, but then his phone buzzed. A message. "Are you coming? We are waiting." There was no name, just the message. Ravi swallowed hard. He didn't reply. He just wanted to get this over with. After another 10 minutes of riding, he finally saw it. House number 14. The house was an old, two-story structure standing alone in the middle of an open field. It looked abandoned, its walls were cracked, the paint was peeling, and the windows were dark. There was no sign of life. Ravi hesitated at the gate, unsure if he should proceed. He checked his phone again. The order details were still there. He took a deep breath, got off his bike, and walked toward the door, carrying the food bag. As he reached the front porch, he noticed the wooden door was slightly open. A faint voice came from inside. "Come in." Ravi froze. He hadn't knocked. His heart pounded against his ribs. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave. But something, whether it was curiosity, duty, or plain stupidity, kept him rooted in place. He stepped inside. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of damp wood and something else, something rotten. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. A dim light flickered in the hallway, barely illuminating the space. The furniture was old and covered in dust. It didn't look like anyone had lived here in years. "Hello?" Ravi called out, his voice barely above a whisper. No response. He walked further inside, his footsteps echoing against the wooden floor. The dining table in the center of the room was set with plates, but they were covered in dust. Rotten food sat on them, untouched for what looked like months, maybe even years. A chair creaked. Ravi spun around, his breath hitching in his throat. Nothing. His fingers gripped the food bag tighter. Something wasn't right. Then his phone vibrated. A new message. "Leave the food on the table." Ravi's hands trembled as he placed the bag down. He turned to leave, but as he stepped toward the door, he heard something behind him. A faint rustling. Then breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. He didn't turn around. He didn't want to. His body screamed for him to run, but his legs felt like they were trapped in wet cement. The breathing grew louder, and then a whisper. "Why are you leaving so soon?" A chill ran down his spine. Ravi bolted. He didn't look back as he ran out of the house, leaped onto his bike, and sped off down the dirt road. His hands shook as he gripped the handlebars, his heart hammering against his ribs. Only when he reached the main road did he dare to slow down. His breathing was ragged. His shirt was soaked in sweat. He pulled out his phone to check the order details again, but the order was gone. No record of it. No message history. Nothing. His stomach twisted into knots. Shaking, he searched for Sharma's Kitchen, the restaurant he had picked up the food from. No results. The restaurant didn't exist. Cold fear gripped his chest. Who had he delivered the food to? That night, Ravi didn't go home. He went straight to a nearby temple, sat on the steps, and stayed there until the first rays of sunlight touched the sky. For weeks, he avoided late-night deliveries. The memory of that night haunted him. And then, one evening, as he scrolled through his phone, a notification popped up. A message. "We are still hungry." Ravi never delivered food at night again. Story: the end.